but just on a bit of history. So the biggest, I think I might have said at the beginning that I think the two biggest barriers are around history and theology, and these are barriers for the church. They're both barriers in the church. The history one is a barrier because we innately think that history doesn't affect us. You can't be telling me, Owen, that things that happened hundreds of years ago are still having an impact on people's lives today. I don't believe it. I don't think that's true. That's kind of how we think. But we think about it in relation to, you know, this kind of history, Black history, which I'll get into in a minute. But we don't think about that when, you know, if you're a Christian here, you may have heard of the Reformation, which happened in the 16th century. And the Reformation literally changed the way Christians engaged with faith. Martin Luther, in that moment, recognizing that it was faith alone that brought you into relationship with God and not other things, that we live in the good of that to today, hundreds and hundreds of years later. History shapes us, history affects us. The issue around history is, firstly, we kind of want to live in denial of it, and we want to just go, oh no, let's just move on. And secondly, we haven't painted the best picture of history. We haven't painted the fullest picture of history. And so I'm just going to talk about it just a little bit. And the reason that I would focus on this, and I would focus on this in particular in relation to Black people, there is other histories and there are other things, but let me just explain why I think there is a unique place around Black history. Obviously, we all understand slavery happened in 16th, 17th century, 18th century. Slavery was at its height in you know, the UK was probably the most powerful slave nation in the world, and so you had, in that period of time, slavery had become, which was new, it had become racialized. Previous to that, people, you know, owned slaves all the time. One tribe owned other people, different groups owned different groups. But in the 17th and 18th century, it became racialized. Africans were taken and they were enslaved in a particular way. And then when that came to an end initially in 1807, that was when the slave trade ended in the British Empire. It carried on in other places, but in the British Empire. And then in 1833 was when slavery ended in the British Empire, but it carried on in other places. In 1833, when slaves were, if you like, set free, they weren't actually set free. They were then given an apprenticeship for 6 years where they had to work for their slave masters. And their slave masters, and you've probably heard this in recent times, were compensated for the loss of revenue that they had in letting their slaves go. And it turned out that I think there were 46,000 people in the UK who owned slaves, many of them literally based in the UK, who owned slaves in different parts of the world. The fact that those slave owners were compensated was an admission that slaves were property, that those people were actually owned by, they were property. They weren't compensated, they weren't spoken to, they were just, you know, in the end when they were released, that was it, they were just let go. So you have this thing about slavery, and we don't often hear about that side of it. It wasn't long after the end of the slave trade that we moved into a time where most of Africa at least was colonized, and a lot of Asia was colonized by European powers. And colonization, it was different to slavery. They weren't owned, but it was a bit like somebody coming into your house, knocking you out the best room in the house, taking it over for themselves, doing it up a bit, doing your house up a bit, but then living there with you. And you might go, okay, I had a house, I didn't have much, but it was my house. And so, you know, you might still want your house back, even if you don't have all the good things that came with it. Colonization literally took, you know, 98% of Africa, I think, was colonized between like 1870 and 1970, 1980. So we went from slavery to colonization in Africa. We went from slavery to, in America, segregation. So Jim Crow laws came in very quickly after the slave trade ended in the States, and that legalized the separation of people. So black people couldn't socialize with white people, they couldn't date white people, they didn't go to the same schools, they didn't live in the same areas. And when they transgressed these rules, the law said one thing, but the people who really held them to account were groups like the Ku Klux Klan. So if a black and a white person fell in love, the black person might be killed because of that, because they didn't want that. So slavery comes to an end, but all that stuff doesn't come to an end. And then at the same time as this going on, this is reinforced by scientific research. You may have heard of the science of eugenics, which was the science that classified the races of people into categories. You had the master race, which were the white, then you had the blacks, which were at the bottom, and you had the Asians kind of in the middle. And that scientific research was actually what drove much of, it drove Nazism, it drove apartheid in South Africa, and it was prevalent in the US and prevalent in the UK, that people did not believe black people were equal in terms of humanity, that they thought they were more animalistic, they were maybe just a little bit more than the average monkey or something like that. That was what people genuinely believed. And so again, you've got this social breakdown, you've got this scientific separation, and then even in the church, people began to justify the use of slaves and the ownership of slaves, and they justified the separation between people because the black people were not quite equal. And they used passages like in Genesis chapter 9. There's a passage there that people use to justify these things. So although slavery happened hundreds of years ago, there is an unbroken line of injustice and inequality that runs from the 17th century, 18th century, right through to today. The first race relations laws that we had in the UK were in 1965, I think it was. And the reason we needed them was because black people were not being treated equally. So we needed laws to help them, essentially. And that law has been updated and updated and updated. My argument, difficult as it might sound, is the residue of the slave owner kind of mindset, the way slave owners treated their slaves, spoke to their black people, actually is not much different to the way you would have heard police officers sometimes treat black people today. That battle with authority, the way George Floyd gets dealt with, it's not much different. There's a residue of that today. There is also a residue of essentially supremacy, people thinking they're better. Now, people might not realize that happens, but there is a residue of people feeling that they're better. And there's definitely a residue of separation and segregation. And you end up living in an area where, you know, nearly every multicultural church, this may not be the case now, but it was a few years ago, almost every multicultural church began white. It began white, and many of them in the end become black, because people leave. And so those things are still prevalent today. They're still prevalent. You know, no one's saying anything, but they are still prevalent. So for me, there's this unbroken line of injustice and inequality. It's not been accepted. It's not even been fully acknowledged. The history is patchy. I found out in the last 6 months that there were 4 million people of color from the colonies that fought in the First World War alongside the British. 4 million. I did not know that. I didn't know it. And so the history is patchy. We don't tell the full history. We don't bring it all out. And we don't like to accept it. And what we're being told is you just have to move on. But think about that for one moment. If you underwent some serious trauma, abuse, and difficulty, and then someone turned around to you and just said, and it happened when you were a kid, and someone turned around to you and said, oh, just move on, you'll be okay. You'll be like, really? History shapes you. It shapes you personally, but it also shapes you generationally. And we're living in a generational form of history that has impacted people. And this is the first time I think we have an opportunity to really do something about it.